My family called me a failure for fixing cars, until the thing in my neighbor's garage made me a millionaire. Growing up, I always knew where I stood in the family pecking order. My parents ran a successful business, and to them, my older brother was a golden child, the heir to their empire. He had everything handed to him on a silver platter. Private tutors, the best summer camps, and when the time came, a brand new car in the driveway with a big red bow on top. Me? I got a pat on the back and a reminder that hard work builds character. I wasn't bitter at first. As a kid, I didn't really understand what was happening. I just knew that my brother got the biggest piece of cake, the latest video game console, and my parents' undivided attention. Meanwhile, I spent my afternoons in the garage, tinkering with old engines and dreaming about cars I'd never be able to afford. My dad would walk by and shake his head, muttering about how mechanics didn't need a college degree. That became their favorite line every time I talked about my passion. I'd point out a cool car on the street, and they'd just sigh and remind me that being a mechanic wouldn't put food on the table. It didn't matter how much I loved it, how I could spend hours taking apart an engine and putting it back together. To them, cars were just a dirty, greasy distraction. Meanwhile, my brother was off preparing for his bright, promising future, one that my parents were more than happy to finance. By the time he graduated high school, my parents had everything mapped out for him. They paid for his tuition, gave him a down payment for his first apartment, and even set him up with a cushy job at the family business. He was living the dream while I was left to figure things out on my own. I wasn't stupid. I knew they wouldn't pay for my college, so I started saving up early. While my friends were out partying, I was working nights at a gas station, changing oil, rotating tires, and scrubbing suspicious stains off bathroom floors for minimum wage. Nothing quite says character building, like fishing somebody's lost phone out of a clogged toilet at 2 a.m. But hey, at least I had job security. Meanwhile, my brother, he was off at college, throwing theme parties at his apartment that my parents paid for. I remember stopping by once to drop off something Mom had sent. The place looked like a hurricane had torn through it. Red cups everywhere. Somebody passed out on the couch with "Help Emmy" written in Sharpie on their forehead. And there was my brother, sitting there like a king on his overpriced leather couch, telling me about how stressful midterms were while sipping a $7 coffee from some fancy local cafe. My parents barely noticed, or maybe they just didn't care. To them, I was wasting my time, working myself to bone for a degree I didn't need. Meanwhile, my brother was coasting through life, never having to worry about student loans or rent checks. I watched as he got handed every opportunity, while I struggled just to keep my head above water. I tried to laugh it off, to play along when my dad cracked jokes about how I'd end up fixing cars behind some gas station. The irony was, I already was, except I was the one keeping the station running. I could rebuild an alternator blindfolded, but sure, let's pretend I was just some kid playing with tools. And yet I kept going. I had no other choice. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for their approval. If they didn't believe in me, fine. I'd prove them wrong. I'd make something of myself without their help. I just didn't realize how much harder that was going to be. The day I finally moved out of my parents' house felt like shedding 100-pound weight off my shoulders. No more backhanded comments about my career choices. No more watching my brother get everything handed to him while I scraped by. Just me, my car, and whatever future I could carve out for myself. The place I found wasn't much, but it was mine. A little rental house just outside the city, tucked at the end of a cracked, uneven road. The paint was peeling. The porch creaked like it was begging for mercy. But inside, it had charm. Old wood floors, a fireplace that may or may not have been safe to use, and a kitchen with just enough counter space to pretend I knew how to cook. I spent the first few days settling in, which mostly meant figuring out where the nearest grocery store was and debating whether I actually needed furniture or if a pile of blankets on a floor counted as a bed. The fridge had a faint, mysterious smell, and the bathroom sink took a full minute to drain. But it was home. The first night, I sat on the floor eating fast food straight from the bag, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. No parent hovering. No brother bragging about his latest success. Just silence, except for the occasional sound of a raccoon making questionable life choices near the trash cans outside. It was perfect. The next morning, I started my new job at a local auto repair shop. Nothing fancy, just a small garage with an old-school neon sign that flickered like it couldn't decide if it wanted to stay on or off. My boss was a guy named Ron, a no-nonsense type who had been fixing cars since dinosaurs roamed the earth. He took one look at me and muttered something about finally getting someone young enough to lift a transmission without throwing out their back. The job itself was exactly what I wanted. Honest work, good people, and the satisfaction of getting my hands dirty fixing something real. I wasn't sitting in some cubicle pretending to be busy. I was making cars run, and that felt good. Plus, there was a diner down the street that served the kind of greasy breakfast that made you question your life choices, but kept you coming back for more. Then there was my neighbor. The first time I saw him, he was standing on his porch, staring at me like I had just moved into his personal nightmare. He was old, maybe in his 70s, with a long face and an expression that could curdle milk. His house made mine look like a luxury estate. The paint was nearly gone, the roof had seen better days, and the lawn was more weeds and grass. Kids in the neighborhood didn't just avoid his house. They crossed the street when walking past, like it was haunted. I waved once. He just turned and went inside without a word. All right then. The locals had plenty of stories about him. Depending on who you asked, he was either a retired war vet, an ex-cop who saw too much, or a guy who buried bodies in his backyard. Nobody knew for sure, because nobody talked to him. The guy was a walking urban legend. One night, I heard something outside. Not the usual raccoon Olympics, but something heavier, slower. I peeked through the window and saw my neighbor standing in his yard, staring up at the sky. No movement, no sound, just standing there like a statue. I told myself it wasn't my business and went back to bed. But something about him kept gnawing at me. There was a story there. I just didn't know if I want to be the one to find out what it was. The thing about living next to someone who clearly doesn't want to be bothered is that eventually, curiosity wins out. I told myself to let it go, to keep my head down and mind my own business. But the mystery of my neighbor gnawed at me like an unfinished puzzle. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I was outside wrestling with my lawnmower, which had decided to die in the middle of my sad excuse for a yard, when I heard my neighbor's voice for the first time. It was gruff, the kind of voice that sounded like it had gone through one too many cups of black coffee and decades of cigarettes. "Hey, you any good with tools?" At first, I thought I misheard him. The guy hadn't so much as acknowledged my existence before, and now he was standing at the edge of my driveway, scratching the back of his neck like he hated the fact that he had to ask me for something. Turned out, something in his garage needed fixing. Now, most people's garages are cluttered with old Christmas decorations and tools they bought once and never use again. But the moment I stepped into his, I felt like I had walked into a time capsule. There, covered in years of dust and neglect, sat a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing. I froze. I had seen pictures of this car before, drooled over in magazines, but never in my wildest dreams did I expect to be standing in front of one in real life. The silver body, the iconic upward opening doors, the sleek design. It was the kind of car that belonged in a museum or parked in some millionaire's showroom, not buried under a layer of dust in a rundown garage. I turned to my neighbor, who was watching me closely, like he was waiting for my reaction. He didn't need to wait long. I had about 1,000 questions, but he waved them off and gestured toward the car. The years hadn't been kind to it. Flat tires, rust creeping along the edges, and an engine that probably hadn't roared to life since before I was born. But even in that state, it was still a thing of beauty. He finally started talking, really talking. The car had been his pride and joy, something he worked on with his father before life got in the way. Somewhere along the line, things fell apart, time passed, and the car became just another thing collecting dust in his garage. That part hit me harder than I expected. I knew what it was like to have dreams shoved aside, to watch other people move forward while you stayed stuck. Maybe that's why, when he asked if I could help him bring it back to life, I didn't even hesitate. Over the next hour, we went over the car, checking what could still be salvaged. The tires were shot, the battery long dead, but the bones of the car were solid. A classic like this deserved a second chance, and maybe just maybe, so did my neighbor. Before I left, he muttered something about how maybe I wasn't as useless as I looked. Coming from him, I took that as a compliment. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer, staring at his garage, wondering just what I got myself into. Spending time in my neighbor's garage quickly became part of my daily routine. What started as a simple favor, checking out an old car, turned into a full-on restoration project. The more time I spent working on that 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, the more I realized something. This wasn't just about fixing a car. It was about bringing something back to life that had been forgotten. And maybe, in a way, that applied to both of us. At first, our conversations were short. Frank wasn't exactly a chatty guy. He was more of the nod and grumble type. But as we worked side by side, he loosened up. Little by little, I started piecing together his story. Frank wasn't just some old guy who kept to himself. He was a former Marine, the kind of guy who had seen things that turned most people's hair gray overnight. After the service, he built a business from nothing. Hard work, long hours, the whole American dream package. But life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you. His wife passed away suddenly, and after that, things unraveled. The business collapsed, the so-called friends disappeared, and even his own family drifted away. That part hit me harder than I expected. The idea that someone who had given everything to others could be left with nothing, it didn't sit right. And as much as he tried to play it off like it didn't bother him, I could tell it did. That's probably why I kept coming back. I wasn't just there for the car anymore. I was there for him. Every evening after work, I'd head straight to his place. We'd spend hours in the garage, covered in grease, pulling apart the engine, sanding down rusted metal, arguing over the best way to fix the suspension. Frank had an old-school way of doing things. If something could be fixed with elbow grease and patience, that's how it got done. No fancy new tools, no shortcuts. You young guys always want the easy way out, he'd say, shaking his head while watching me struggle with a rusted bolt. You gotta earn it. One afternoon, after spending way too long wrestling with a rusted bolt that refused to budge, I heard a loud crack from outside. At first, I thought something had fallen over in the yard. But then I saw it. The old man's roof, or at least part of it, was barely hanging on. Frank noticed me looking and just waved it off, saying it had been like that for years. That's when I decided to fix it. The next day, I showed up with my toolbox and a ladder. He grumbled about how he didn't need any help, but I ignored him and got to work. The roof wasn't the only thing that needed repairs. His porch was falling apart. The gutters were barely holding on, and don't even get me started on the fence that looked like it was one strong breeze away from collapsing. You planning on charging me for this? He asked after watching me hammer nails into his roof for over an hour. I just shook my head. Consider it a neighborhood discount. For the first time since I met him, Frank actually laughed. Not a full belly laugh, more like a quiet chuckle, but it was something. A few days later, he tried to pay me, pulled out an old, crumpled envelope stuffed with cash, and shoved it in my direction. I shook my head and told him to keep it. That was the first time I saw something shift in his expression. He nodded, cleared his throat, and muttered something about me having a good heart. Said I'd go far in life, that people like me made the world a little less disappointing. That stuck with me. By then, the car wasn't just a project anymore. It was a symbol of something bigger. Redemption, second chances, proof that things, no matter how broken, could be put back together. And maybe, just maybe, that applied to Frank too. Life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you just when things start making sense. 1 minute, Frank and I were in his garage, laughing over how much rust we'd scraped off the Mercedes. And the next, I was standing in a hospital room, staring at a man who looked nothing like the grumpy, sharp-witted guy I had come to know. It happened fast. Too fast. One day, he mentioned he wasn't feeling great, just a little dizzy, nothing major. The next, I found him slumped on his porch, barely breathing. The ambulance came with sirens screaming. But even then, Frank tried to wave me off like I was making a big deal out of nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The doctors weren't optimistic. His body had taken one too many hits over the years. War, hard work, loss. It all added up. I sat by his bedside, watching the beeping machines, wondering how the hell this man, who had seemed invincible, could look so fragile. One night, when visiting hours were almost over, he motioned for me to come closer. His voice was weak, but his words hit hard. "That car, she's yours now. You're the only one who ever gave a damn about it." I shook my head. I told him not to talk like that we'd finish the car together, take it for a spin, maybe even get it to the show. But he just gave me that look. The same look he'd give me whenever I fumbled with a stubborn bolt or underestimated how much elbow grease a job would take. Listen to me. Good people, they need a break sometimes. I never had a son, but if I did, I'd want him to be like you. I felt my throat tighten. Frank wasn't the kind of guy to say things just to say them. Every word meant something. I nodded, pretending like I could accept it, but deep down, I wasn't ready to. The next morning, the hospital called. Frank had passed in his sleep. The funeral was small, just a handful of people, most of them from the neighborhood. His so-called family? Nowhere to be seen. Not that I was surprised. They'd forgotten about him years ago. Afterward, I met with his lawyer. That's when I learned just how much Frank had planned for me. He didn't just leave me the car. He left me everything. The house, the garage, even what little savings he had left. I sat in that office, holding the keys to a life I hadn't expected. I glanced at the paperwork. My name printed neatly where it used to be. "You okay, kid?" The lawyer asked, probably used to seeing people stunned like this. I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding. "Yeah," I muttered. "I just didn't see this coming." "Frank had a good eye for people," the lawyer said, shuffling the papers back into a folder. "If he thought you deserved this, you probably do." I walked out of that office with a weight I hadn't felt before. Not a bad weight, just something new. Responsibility. Legacy. A second chance at something bigger than just fixing an old car. That night, I stood in Frank's garage, staring at the Gold Wing. It looked different now, less like a project and more like a promise. I had no idea what I was supposed to do next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. It didn't take long for my family to come knocking, not when there was money involved. It actually started a few weeks before they showed up at my door. My brother had car trouble, something about his precious Jeep making a weird noise, and he didn't trust just any mechanic. So, for the first time in years, he rolled up to the shop where I worked, looking for a favor. I could tell he wasn't thrilled about asking me for help, but I played along, checked out his car, and told him it wasn't anything serious, just a minor fix. While I was working, we got to talking, and I casually mentioned Frank leaving me the house. Wait, some old guy just gave you a house? Like for free?" he asked, incredulous. "It's not exactly in mint condition," I said. "It needs a lot of work. But yeah, he left it to me." That was all he needed to hear. He wanted to see it. I should have known better, but part of me thought maybe, just maybe, he'd just be curious. When we pulled up to the house, he took one look at it and started laughing. "Dude, this place looks like it should have been condemned 10 years ago," he snorted. "Are you seriously living here?" I shrugged. "It's mine, and I'm fixing it up." He shook his head, still laughing, and then, as if his day couldn't get any better, he spotted the car in the garage. At first, he barely looked at it. To him, it was just an old, dusty wreck. "You actually driving that thing?" he smirked. "Not yet. I'm restoring it." "Man, you really took the whole old guy leave you junked in a heart, huh? A busted house and a busted car? Living the dream. Little bro." I let it go. It wasn't worth the argument, but I should have seen it coming. A couple weeks later, I got a text from him. "Dude, call me. You have no idea what that car is worth." I already knew, and I already knew what was coming next. The next day, my parents showed up at my doorstep. My dad had that look he always got when he was trying to act like he was doing me a favor, but really just wanted something. My mom, as usual, was playing peacemaker, acting like this was just a friendly family visit. My brother? He barely waited until I opened the door before blurting it out. "You do realize that car is worth millions, right?" I leaned against the doorframe. Yeah, I do. So he ran a hand through his hair, the way he always did when he thought he was the smartest guy in the room. We could sell it. Split the money. It's only fair. Fair. That was rich coming from him. I crossed my arms. Why would I sell it? Because it's money, he said like I was a complete idiot. Real, life-changing money. You could finally get out of this place. Do something with your life. We all could. I felt something bubble up in my chest, and it took me a second to realize it was laughter. We all could. You mean you, right? Because I don't remember any of you caring about me before that car was worth something. Dad cleared his throat. That's not fair. We've always supported you. That did it. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Supported me? You mean like when I had to pay my own way through college while you covered everything for him? Or when I was working nights while he got a brand new Jeep for his graduation? That kind of support. Mom sighed, using that tone she always did when she was about to guilt-trip me. Sweetheart, we just think you should be smart about this. Think of what you could do with that money. I shook my head. Frank didn't leave me that car so I could sell it to the highest bidder. He left it because he knew I'd appreciate it, because he knew I'd take care of it. My brother scoffed. So what? You're just going to let it sit in a garage and rot? It's just a car. I felt my hands clench into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. It's not just a car. You wouldn't understand. Dad stepped forward. Try and play the authority figure. You're being ridiculous. That car could change your life. And you owe it to us, after everything we've done for you. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. Everything you've done for me? Like what? The silence stretched uncomfortably. My brother opened his mouth, then closed it. My mom shifted, looking at the ground. My dad's face hardened. We're family, he finally said, and family looks out for each other. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. Yeah, funny how that only seems to apply when you need something. Mom's eyes welled up, like she was about to play the guilt card. My brother scowled. Dad just shook his head like I was a lost cause. You're making a mistake, he said, and you'll regret it. I didn't say anything. I just stepped back and shut the door. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free. No guilt, no strings, no expectations. Just me, the house, and the car Frank left me. And for the first time, I knew exactly who my real family was. I threw myself into the restoration like a man possessed. After the disaster with my family, working on a Gull Wing wasn't just about fixing a car anymore. It was about proving something to myself more than anyone else. Every rusted bolt I loosened, every dent I smoothed out, every part one replaced. It was all a step toward something bigger than just getting the car back on the road. At first, it was just me, the garage, and a never-ending supply of coffee. Some nights, I'd pass out on the old couch in the garage, waking up with a wrench still in my hand. My hands were always covered in grease. My back ached constantly, but I didn't care. The Gull Wing was coming back to life, and that was all that mattered. After a few weeks, I started thinking, why not document the process? I wasn't some influencer, but I figured it might be cool to look back on later. So I set up an old tripod, dusted off my phone, and started recording bits of my work. I posted the first video without much thought, just a short clip of me wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of the engine. I captioned it something like, asterisk, bringing a 55 Gull Wing back to life, one headache at a time. Asterisk, I went to bed that night, expecting maybe a few likes from random car guys. The next morning, my phone was blowing up. Apparently, people liked watching a guy covered in grease cursing an ancient German machine. The video had tens of thousands of views. My follower count? Exploding. Car guys, collectors, even total strangers who didn't know a thing about cars. Everyone wanted to see what happened next. The comments were filled with questions, advice, and even a few people offering to send me parts for free just to see the project finished. So I kept posting. More videos, progress updates, time-lapse of me restoring different parts. The comments were insane. People sharing their own restoration stories, offering suggestions, even arguing over whether I should keep the original paint or go for something new. It wasn't just a car project anymore. It had become something bigger. A few weeks later, I hit 100,000 followers. I was stunned. People actually cared about this project, about my project. I was getting sponsorship offers, requests for collaborations, things I never imagined would happen just because I was fixing up an old car. Then the collectors started showing up. I got my first message from a guy who owned a private collection of classic cars, asking if I'd ever consider selling. Then another, and another. These weren't just casual fans. These were guys with deep pockets, people who saw the Gull Wing as a golden ticket. Then came the big one, a well-known collector, one of those guys with more money than he knows what to do with, offered me an obscene amount of cash, and not just for the finished car. He wanted it as it was, unfinished, a piece of history in progress, as he called it. For a split second, I considered it. The money could change everything. I could buy a better house, start my own shop, never have to answer to anyone again. No more late nights in the garage, no more busted knuckles, no more stress about whether or not I could afford the next part one needed. But then I looked at the car, at the work I'd put in, at the community that had built up around it. Selling it now? That would mean giving up everything Frank left me, everything I had built. So I turned him down. My mom would have called me crazy. My brother definitely would have. But I didn't care. This wasn't just about the money anymore. If this car could bring people together, if it could make people care, then I wasn't going to waste that opportunity. I had a better idea. I went back into the garage, wiped the sweat off my forehead, and hit record on my phone. This was just the beginning. The Gull Wing wasn't just a car anymore. It was a movement. The restoration process had taken on a life of its own, pulling in thousands of followers, collectors, and car enthusiasts from every corner of the internet. And as much as I loved every minute of working on that car, something became painfully clear. I wasn't just fixing up an old classic. I was sitting on the opportunity of a lifetime. For the first time, I started thinking bigger. The interest in my work was undeniable. People weren't just watching. They were reaching out, asking if I could restore their cars, if I could help them track down rare parts, if I was taking on commissions. At first, I brushed it off. I was just a guy with a garage and a camera, not some high-end restoration shop. But the requests kept coming. Then came the offers. Real money. People were willing to pay for what I was doing. I sat in my garage one night, staring at the Gull Wing, grease-stained hands gripping a coffee cup that had long gone cold. This was my shot. I had to take it. The next morning, I walked into my bank and applied for a business loan. I half expected them to laugh me out of the place, but the numbers spoke for themselves. My social media presence was strong. I had a dedicated following, and the demand was through the roof. It took a few meetings, a mountain of paperwork, and a ridiculous amount of waiting, but eventually I walked out of there with enough funding to get things rolling. I found an old industrial space on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it had the bones of what I needed. High ceilings, enough room for a few cars at a time, and a tiny office that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. It wasn't much, but it was mine. At first, it was just me, one guy, a toolbox, and an impossible workload. The first few clients were people who had followed my journey with the Gull Wing. They trusted me, and that meant everything. Word spread fast. Within a month, I had more work than I could handle alone. I started bringing in extra hands. Guys I'd worked with at the shop before, a couple of younger mechanics who were eager to learn. Before I knew it, I had a real team, a real business. One afternoon, as I was finishing up a job, a man in a tailored suit walked into the shop, looking entirely out of place among the grease and engine parts. He was a serious collector, one of those guys with climate-controlled garage and a collection worth more than most houses. He wasn't here for small talk. I wiped my hands on a rag and gave him a nod. "What can I do for you?" "I've been following your work," he said, scanning the shop. "I want you to restore a car for me." A real challenge. He handed me a folder. Inside were photos of a completely wrecked 1967 Shelby GT500. Rusted frame, torn interior, missing half its parts. It was a disaster, and I couldn't have been more excited. "How long do you need?" he asked. I grinned. "Give me 6 months." As he walked out, I looked around my shop, and realized something. This wasn't just about the Gull Wing anymore. This was the beginning of something much, much bigger. Later that night, I sat on the hood of the Gull Wing, scrolling through my messages. More requests, more opportunities. People wanted to see what I'd do next. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just some guy fixing up old cars. I was running a business, and I was just getting started. Once the shop was running smoothly, I realized something. I didn't just want to restore cars. I wanted to find them. The rare ones. The forgotten ones. The ones sitting under tarps in barns, collecting dust in overgrown backyards, or wasting away in junkyards where nobody realized what they had. So I hit the road. My first big find was a 1969 Dodge Charger, half buried in a farmer's field outside of Tulsa. It took 3 days, 2 tow trucks, and a whole lot of negotiating over homemade pie and black coffee, but I drove away with the deal of a lifetime. The old guy who owned it said it had been sitting there since the late 80s, after his son blew the engine. He thought it was worthless. I knew better. I started making road trips part of my routine. I'd spend hours scrolling through classified ads, diving deep into obscure car forums, even knocking on doors when I spotted something interesting in the driveway. It was the ultimate treasure hunt, and the best part? The stories. Every car had one. A Vietnam vet who parked his '64 Mustang after deployment and never drove again. A widow who kept her late husband's Chevy Bel Air in the garage for decades because she couldn't bear to let it go. The guy who inherited a Plymouth Barracuda but had no idea what it was worth. It wasn't just about the money. It was about bringing history back to life. Sure, the cash was great, but nothing beat the feeling of firing up an engine that hadn't roared in decades. Every time I got behind the wheel of a car that was once left for dead, it felt like I was giving it a second shot at glory. The more I found, the more I restored, and before long, the money started rolling in. Serious money. I wasn't just scraping by anymore. I was flipping cars for hundreds of thousands of dollars. What started as a one-man operation in an old garage had turned into something much bigger. My shop was now a full-fledged business, and I had a waiting list of clients who wanted their dream cars brought back to life. At some point, I stopped seeing myself as just a mechanic. I was a businessman, a damn good one. It didn't happen overnight, but eventually, I hit a milestone I never thought possible. I bought a house. Not just any house. My house. A sprawling place outside the city with a massive garage, enough space in my collection, and, for the first time in my life, room to breathe. No more worrying about rent. No more side gigs to make ends meet. I could finally enjoy what I had built. And man, did I enjoy it. I bought myself a brand new Ford Raptor just because I could. Took a weekend trip down the Pacific Coast Highway in a freshly restored '67 Corvette. Treated myself to a ridiculous home theater setup where I could finally watch my favorite movies without hearing my neighbor's dog barking through the walls. But the best part? The freedom. No boss. No family members telling me what I should do with my life. No regrets. Just me, the open road, and whatever classic beauty I stumbled upon next. There were still moments where I'd sit in my garage at night, beer in hand, looking at the cars I had saved. I thought about Frank sometimes, wondering what he'd think about all of this. Maybe he knew what he was doing all along when he left me that Gull Wing. Maybe he saw something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. The business was booming, the money was good, and life had finally turned into something I controlled. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Success had a funny way of bringing people back into your life. The same people who once counted you out. I was living proof of that. It started with a phone call from my mother, then another, and another. I ignored them all. I knew how this worked. But when they showed up at my shop unannounced, I knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. They looked different, tired, stressed, not like the people who once sneered at my choices. My father, the man who had spent years dismissing my passion for cars as a waste of time, looked like he had aged a decade. My mother, always the peacemaker, had that desperate look in her eyes, the kind she used when she wanted to guilt-trip me. The family business wasn't doing well. Something about bad investments, market downturns, and a few deals gone sideways. My brother wasn't there, but I figured he was waiting to hear how this played out before making an appearance. Typical. They dance around the point at first, talking about how proud they were of me, how far I had come, how impressive my shop was. I let them talk. I let them try to rewrite history. Then my father finally got to the point. They needed money, not a loan, an investment. They wanted me to help save their business. I leaned against the hood of a '67 Camaro. I was restoring and listened, really listened. The old me might have felt some pull, some sense of obligation. But that version of me was long gone. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly before answering. You didn't believe in me when I needed you. You didn't think I was worth the investment. You left me to figure it out on my own. And I did. Silence. My father's jaw clenched. My mother's eyes watered. I waited for the argument, the justifications, the pleas. But they had nothing, because they knew I was right. I don't owe you anything. I continued. You weren't there for me when I was struggling. And I'm not going to be there for you now. You figure it out, just like I did. My mother reached for my arm, but I stepped back, not in anger, just in finality. I had made my decision. They weren't part of my life anymore. They left without another word. I watched them go, feeling nothing but clarity. No guilt, no regret, just the satisfaction of knowing I had built something on my own, without them. Later that evening, I slid into the driver's seat of my fully restored Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing. The engine purred like a dream, every inch a testament to my hard work. I ran my hand over the steering wheel, thinking of Frank. He was the only one who had ever really believed in me. And in that moment, I knew I had done him proud. I pulled out onto the open road, the headlights cutting through the dusk, the hum of the engine filling the silence. I wasn't just driving a car. I was driving my future on my own terms. I passed by the town where I grew up, where everything started. It didn't feel like home anymore. Home was wherever I parked my car, wherever I chose to be. As I hit the highway, I glanced at my phone. Another message from a collector looking for a rare restoration. More opportunities. More possibilities. I smiled, shifted gears, and stepped on the gas. This was just the beginning.